Thank you all for being here. It's great to see a lot of faces that I know in the room and folks who could actually teach this Palestine 101 workshop. Rada Kassena, who is a staff attorney at the Palestinian Legal Defense Fund.
Actually, it's Palestine Solidarity Legal Support, but close enough.
Well, Legal Defense Fund is a good name in case y'all ever need to change it. And my name is Nuda Erakat. I'm a human rights attorney and starting in the fall, tenure track faculty at George Mason University. So, the reason I'm actually, Corby and I discussed this, and we were talking about, well, what is it that we should do on Palestine at this social justice radical lawyering conference? And my response to Corby was, look, I think, based on my experience, that the natural inclination for radical lawyers and for radical activists is to support Palestine in some shape, way, or form. But I think when it gets down to the substance of it, we get lost. And that's not surprising. It's very deliberate because of the way that the conflict is framed, especially in the United States, as being confusing, as being a primordial disagreement, an ethnic conflict, a religious conflict, when in fact it's a political conflict based, it emerges in a colonial setting. It's a derivative of a British Empire, British and French Empire, or I guess British and French colonial holdings, well after their British Empire. And so wanted to have a conversation about how that reflects the conflict today and implications for our solidarity and activism work. So I'll be doing kind of a Palestine 101 on framing, and then handing it off to Radhika. Do you want to talk about what
I can talk about it when the time comes.
That works too. Okay, but just know that the way that we divided it is that I'll be doing more of the framing, and Radhika will be, I think, speaking directly to what it means to be a radical lawyer on these issues in the United States. So with that, this is international law and Palestinians, but forget that, let's just talk a little bit about what the conflict means. This is why we call this Mandate Palestine. This was the name of it under the British mandate, and it was categorized as C because it was amongst the most ready. Now the challenge to this, and one myth about the existence of Palestine at all, is that, and what Golda Meir, this is Golda Meir's famous saying, Palestine is a land without a people for a people without a land. And in that, there was no negation that there were actual people there, but this was a reference to people in the sense of international law and peoplehood. So that if you were a people, you are eligible for self-determination. And so this saying that it's a land without a people for people without a land was to negate that these were a civilized, organized people, and instead were more akin to savages who needed to be civilized and would benefit from the advent of some sort of another colonial imposition, right? Okay, so why does Palestine then become a target while other countries are actually, or other, I guess, colonized land masses are actually becoming independent in 1948? There's only two countries that come under new occupation. And do folks know what they are? So here we're in an era where India is becoming independent of British, right? British colonization. Countries are shaking off the yoke of their colonization. There are two countries that come under new colonization in 1948. South Africa is one, and here's a hint. Oh, yes, Palestine is the other one, right? This happens in 1948. Why is this happening here? Why does this become a specific target? In many ways, it is a response to the Jewish question. And the Jewish question is specifically the systematic targeting, discrimination, and violence against Jewish people, mostly in Europe. right? And the response to this systematic discrimination comes in several forms. One is a Bundist response, which is rooted in an anti-chauvinist, anti-nationalist response that we need a socialist solution that diminishes the chauvinism of all nationalisms and to integrate Jewish people into the rest of European countries. And another response, and this is only one of many, is Zionism. And Zionism proposes that no, the actual response needs to be the establishment of a state for Jewish people, right? And so that the establishment of the state is the only way to be determined. There was conflict about this, and what catalyzed the support for Zionism and the eclipse of other options was in fact the tragedy and mass murder of Jewish persons and others in the Holocaust during World War II. So this catalyzes the support for Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel, although waves of immigration begin much earlier in the early 20th century, right? So by 1947, at the start of the Arab-Israeli War, Jewish persons owned 7% of this land, okay? And the indigenous Arab, Christian, Muslim, Palestinian population owned 94% of the land. And UN Resolution 181, so the United Nations, by the way, is established only a few years before this moment, right? And this becomes really important when we think about the Palestinian refugee question and the UN's responsibility to them and their distinction in the refugee legal regime, and we can talk about that if some of you are interested in refugee law. But on this question specifically, the UN proposes that 45% of the least arable land be given to the Arabs, right, who already own 96% of it, and that 55% of the most arable land, we're talking about the coastal lands, be given to the Jewish persons who own 7% of the land. This is UN Resolution 181, or the partition plan for 2 states for 2 people, right, in 1947. Notably, in UN Partition 181, there's stipulation clause that there shall be no discrimination based on ethnic or religious origin. So that even the Partition Plan 181 did not suggest the transfer of the 2 populations, nor did it stipulate that these would be ethnically homogeneous new states. To the contrary, there would be no discrimination on that basis, and this is key because this is in stark contrast to the discourse on the 2-state solution today. Okay? The Arab partners, or the Arab leadership at this time, rejects the partition plan, and then the Arab-Israeli war ensues. At the end of that war, Israel has control over this entire area in lighter color, and what becomes the West Bank, which you all are probably familiar with, the occupied West Bank, comes under the trusteeship of Jordan, and the Gaza Strip comes up under the trusteeship of Egypt. This is 1948, okay? So today when we talk about occupation of Palestine, we're only talking about this, 22% of historic mandate Palestine. And when we talk about the 2-state solution, the idea is that this would remain Israel, and that these somehow with a bridge or some tunnel or something, helicopters, it's not real clear, that this would then be the Palestinian state, okay? That's kind of where our basic understanding is when we talk, and even that has been in controversy, right? And now the 2-state solution is declared by our Secretary of State, John Kerry, as dead, right? Even he's declared the death of the 2-state solution, and in a minute I'll show you exactly why. My object here is to demonstrate why the 2-state solution was never really part of the plan, and that this conflict is one that goes back to the definition of Zionism, which is not just to establish a homeland for Jewish people, but to establish a homeland for Jewish people where 80% of the population is Jewish. Okay? That's the heart of why this conflict continues. And then we'll go into this. So, I mentioned 1948, there's war. What happens in war? To avoid going into excessive details, just enough to say that as a result of war, right? Here's lawyers, we're being passive. As a result of war, we don't know why or because of, who did it. But as a result of war, right? 531 Arab villages are destroyed, and a refugee population of approximately 700,000 Palestinians is created, because there was a population of approximately 800,000 Palestinians. Those 700,000 Palestinians today constitute, together with the refugee population that ensues from the 1967 war, and I'll get to that as well, now constitute approximately a 6.6 million refugee population of Palestinians. Okay? That's one. Two, the 100,000 Palestinians don't go anywhere. They stay within Israel. And today that population is approximately 1.3 to 1.4 million. That's 20% of Israel's population. So 20% of Israel's population today is Palestinian, Christian, and Arab. So the demand that Israel be a Jewish state is a demand for de jure discrimination against 20% of its own population. All right. Now, Israel has had many choices of how to resolve. Oh, so let me get to 1967, and this is all, Cliff's Notes. And stop me if you need to ask questions. Yes?
I'm so sorry, just trying to keep track of the numbers so I'm not...
Sure.
Not
Can I write it somewhere? Okay, yeah.
So the 6.6 or 6 point whatever million refugees, are you talking about people who have left the region? Is that people?
Oh, excellent question. So the 700,000 that flee,
yes,
flee to the West Bank and flee to Gaza.
Ah, okay.
So Gaza, right, 3/4 of the population in Gaza, or approximately 750,000 people, are refugees.
Okay.
So which means that they are dependent also on UN, some sort of UN aid for survival. Also, and that's because of the siege and that kind of thing, okay? The others flee throughout 58 refugee camps in the Middle East, and yet others flee throughout a global diaspora, right? And so have citizenship elsewhere. Okay, now what happens? So I've told you 1948, 100,000 remain, 700,000 Palestinians become refugees, 531 villages destroyed. And this was very explicit as part of those who founded Israel because, and I can read you a quote, but let me spare you since I can provide quotes, but suffice it to say that the founders of Israel had a choice to coexist with the indigenous population, but chose not to. To the contrary, they saw them as impediments and saw them as a menace to the establishment of a Jewish state where there was an 80% Jewish majority. And so hence the creation of this refugee population and their continued exclusion from returning to this day. Okay? Now, speed forward. Between 1948 and 1966, Israel imposes military law. Military law is ruled by force rather than by consent, and it's a derivative of British Empire, where it actually perfected military law in order to suppress indigenous uprisings in Malaysia, British Guyana, and elsewhere, right, including Mandate Palestine. Israel continues to impose that military law only on its non-Jewish citizens between 1948 and 1966 here, within Israel, right? 1967, and now we get into another war, and here's the Six-Day War, the 1967 war, also not going into attributing blame. There is a war. Okay, there is a war. And I can answer questions about that, what I think about that war, whether or not it was preemptive, and this gets us into whether or not preemptive self-defense is legal under the law of self-defense or not. But anyway, 1967, there is a war. Now Israel occupies Gaza, the Gaza Strip, and the West Bank. So when we talk about military occupation, we're beginning from 1967, and specifically about the occupation of these two territories as a result of the Six-Day War, which had hitherto been controlled by Jordan and Egypt. But Palestinians laid their claim about the denial of their self-determination and their exclusion from 1948. So for those of you who have been following this and find confusion, this is why some of these numbers matter. Okay? Israel occupies the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967. At this point, Israel has choices, right? It wants to be a Jewish and a democratic state, right? But the problem is that for it to be the Jewish state it has defined itself as, it needs to maintain an 80% Jewish population. The problem with that is that here, 20% of this population is non-Jewish. And if it takes into account the territories that it occupied, where it's also, and we're going to get into this as well, where it's also settling its own civilian population, there are blurred lines, no reference to Robin Thicke at all. Okay? But there are blurred lines, and now the balance of the population is 6.1, approximately, since October 2012, 6.1 million Jewish persons and 5.9 million Palestinians. Okay? So already this demographic balance is in threat. And it's why Israeli politicians and media outlets refer to Palestinians as a demographic threat, because those numbers matter. I mean, look, that's really racist. I know we kind of, glazing over it by calling it demographic threat, but that's basically saying that Palestinians who have babies are a security threat to the nation, right? That's what that means. So what does it mean for Israel to be, and then in addition to the fact that 6.1 million to 5.9 million, also consider that by 2025, according to geographer Salman Abu Sitteh, the Palestinian population within Israel will outnumber the Jewish population. So by natural population growth, this demographic balance is not sustainable. And if you take in the occupied territories, you have a major problem, because it won't be sustainable within the next 2 years. So what does Israel do? So for it to be Jewish and democratic, it basically means three things. As I've mentioned, the Jews form the majority of the state. We've established 80%. Jews established 80% of the state. That Jewish persons are entitled to preferential treatment. Yes?
Where's the 80% figure come from? Is that explicitly stated?
Yes, that comes from David Ben Gurion, who is one of the founders and two-time prime ministers of Israel. So Jews are entitled to certain preferential treatment. Nothing that Israel or any of its supporters are shy about. They say, of course, they would be entitled to preferential treatment. It's a Jewish state, right? But that means that the only democracy in the Middle East has in its law 30 laws that explicitly privilege Jewish persons or disadvantage non-Jewish persons within the state as a matter of prima facie legal interpretation. Okay? And the law of return is one of them. The law of return establishes that a Jewish person anywhere in the world can claim Israeli citizenship upon disembarkation in Israel. Okay? In contrast, Palestinians who are guaranteed the right of return by UN Resolution 194, 1948, are denied the right to even return home, as opposed to traveling and claiming citizenship. Okay, that's just one example. And thirdly, there's a reciprocal relationship that exists between the state of Israel and Jews anywhere in the world, which means that Israel has more duty to those without its country, its non-citizens, its Jewish nationals, than it does to its own citizens. Which puts its democratic nature into stark question. Okay, just as a point of, what we can get into a discussion of what we mean by democracy. but just this very liberal notion of democracy, of ruling by consent and of the people. Here you have sanguineous nationality versus citizenship, and a relationship that Israel has more obligation to its Jewish nationals than it does to its own citizens. So someone here, right, someone in this neighborhood who's Jewish, theoretically has more rights than the Palestinian Christian in Nazareth, whose family has been there for hundreds of years, right? Which puts into question, what does it mean then? Who does the state protect, right? Okay. Now, add to that there is no guarantee to equality. The only democracy in the Middle East does not have a constitution. Okay? It does not have a constitution. It does have something called basic laws. This is the only one that might refer, there's no guarantee to equality in the basic laws, and any of the laws, there's a stipulation that it's not retroactive. This prohibition on retroactivity means that all laws that were written between 1948 and 1992, which had facilitated the forced removal of Palestinians, which had facilitated the immigration and implantation of more Jewish persons, right, that had privileged the Jewish population at the expense of the indigenous population, all remain in force, notwithstanding the 1992 basic laws. All right? Okay. Now, we're back. Israel now has four choices. It wants to be Jewish and democratic. It has a problem with demography. It has four choices of how to solve this problem. It can establish a two-state solution. If it established a two-state solution, it would affirm that these are the borders of Israel, and these are the borders of Palestine, and it would contain the Palestinian population, right? And it would just maintain its majority here, its 80% majority here. For those who believe in this vision, it seems like a pretty good deal, right? And Israel has single-handedly, right, destroyed the two-state solution between 1993 at the signing of the Oslo Accords and the present day. In the 2 decades of Oslo, it has destroyed the possibility of a two-state solution, and I'll show why. Okay? The second option, establish one state. Oh, and this is really, really important. Israel never declared its borders. So it doesn't have a constitution, and it never declared its borders. So these lines you see here are meaningless. Israel has steadily expanded here and here. Here into Gaza Strip as a result of war, and into the West Bank as a result of settlement expansion. Okay? So no constitution, no borders, no right to equality, but definitely the only democracy in the Middle East. All right. So second solution, establish one state for all people. Kind of makes sense to us, right? One state, all people, no discrimination based on religion, nationality, creed, color, one person, one vote, right? It works for us, kind of. We're working on that. You all are working on that, right? But Israel has rejected that outright, because doing that would immediately disrupt the 80% majority. And Israel can no longer claim that it's, that this is the Jewish and democratic state. It would just be the democratic state with Jewish and non-Jewish citizens, or Jewish, Christian, Arab, Muslim citizens, right? Third option is, well, it's kind of what is existing today. Israel will rule by force, where if the population increases, a minority Jewish population will rule over a majority Christian, Muslim, Arab population. Okay? And by the way, many of Jewish persons are also Arab, from Yemen and Morocco and Iraq and Syria and Algeria, but they are racialized into a category of Mizrahim. And so, but that's another thing about Israeli sociology, and we can also discuss that in Q&A. If I confuse you, just kind of wave, right? So, because we can go in many different directions, but I want to be, everything's on the table, but let me just go through this. So now Israel Third option is the Jewish majority rules over a Christian and Muslim majority. Jewish minority rules over a majority. Sounds like, looks like, smells like apartheid, right? And in fact, because there is only one governing government, only Israel has control over these entire areas, right? That's in fact what exists today. Now, Israeli leaders deny this and say that there's some modicum of self-control in the West Bank, and about 6% of the West Bank in the Gaza Strip, and claim that since the unilateral withdrawal in 2005, Gaza is no longer occupied under an international law analysis. That's just not true. Something called effective control of the Hague regulations. Again, you can ask me in Q&A, but suffice it to say that this remains occupied territory. And Israel actually does exercise an apartheid regime already, but its leaders, from Ehud Olmert to Tzipi Livni and Ehud Barak, have said that unless we establish a two-state solution, it's either we have to provide one vote for one person, in which case we no longer have a Jewish state, or we don't have one vote for one person, in which case we have an apartheid state. Okay, and so they don't want that for PR reasons. Even though now Israel has one of the most right-wing governments it's ever had, and 2 weeks ago its governing coalition, its right-wing governing coalition proposed 10 laws that would annex 62% of the West Bank or all of Area C, okay, which remained under Israel's control in the aftermath of the peace process. Okay, so we're already seeing this in motion. It's already happening, even if they say, as a matter of PR, that's not the case. And then the fourth option is, we'll just diminish the Palestinian population in number, we'll concentrate them geographically to be controlled, and we'll erase their history physically and metaphysically in a process of ongoing ethnic cleansing. And as research suggests, that's in fact what Israel has pursued. Today it has an apartheid government or regime, and it's pursuing the continued ethnic cleansing of Palestinians to diminish the population, to geographically concentrate them, and to erase them physically and metaphysically from history as well as from the land. Okay? And the peace process was used very conveniently to allow Israel to continue this process while it benefited from the diplomatic, right? The diplomatic heyday or the diplomatic appeal of peace and engagement. Okay, so why do I say that? How dare I say that? So here is, and let me move over here and show you this. How many of you heard of an organization, an Israeli organization called Peace Now? All right, Peace Now is an Israeli organization that opposes settlements. It is it believes in the two-state solution. It believes that Palestinians should be given their state, and that someone will fund helicopters or bridges in order to create some contiguity. But the point is that it believes in the two-state solution, and so it monitors the building of settlements. So Israel if it wanted the two-state solution, I suggested that it actually killed the two-state solution in the past 20 years. Why do I say that? Well, for one, this is a map, right? And here are some overlays. I suggest that you play with this. So here's the green line, the non-declared border. You see the outline of the green line? Here's the West Bank. Here's the Gaza Strip. Okay. Now Israel in 2002 began the building of something called, what it calls the West Bank barrier, what the International Court of Justice has called the separation barrier, what Palestinians refer to as their Apartheid Wall. Okay? Israel suggests that it built the wall in order to protect itself from suicide bombings, and the ICJ in 2004 advisory opinion said Israel has every right to build a wall to protect itself, but if it's to build that wall, it should build it on this green line. But where has Israel built the wall? You see that? Goes in, juts in, goes look how far deep into the West Bank it goes as far, this is the Jordan Valley. This is 30% of the West Bank. Eats up all this land. 13% of the route of this wall meanders through the West Bank, effectively confiscating 85%. Oh, sorry, 85% of the wall meanders into the West Bank, effectively confiscating 13% of that land. Okay? In contravention of occupation law, for those of you, I know BAG does this, anybody into laws of war? Okay, so laws of war, the Fourth Geneva Convention on the Protection of Civilians During Time of Warfare, Civilians and Civilian Objects, of course Maria, hello, my teacher on this. This is a war crime. To confiscate and to alter the territorial integrity of land that's occupied is a war crime, okay, under this law. But why does law matter, right? Okay, now, let's look at what's up with the route of this wall like this? Okay, here's why. Military outposts, these are built by Israelis who are so driven by, some sort of divine decree that they have more allegiance to God than they do to the state of Israel. So they will on their own go ahead and build a camp in the middle of a Palestinian, for example, neighborhood or village. Destroy Palestinians, they'll just build it. In any other context, if you do that, they will suffer severe retribution. They do not in this case, because this will be protected by the Israeli military and eventually become a settlement. Now, Israeli settlements, right, are exactly what they are, colonial settlements. So this is the transfer of Israel's civilian population into territory that it occupies in contravention of Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, of Article 8 of the Rome Convention, and also a war crime. Okay? Let's think about why law matters. And then it's for Jewish people only. These aren't mixed housing units, right? This isn't a benefit to the territory. These are for Jewish persons only. They are built on Palestinian land for which Palestinians are not confiscated. They require the destruction of Palestinian homes and fields, right, for which they are not compensated. They are protected by Israeli soldiers that now protect the settlers against Palestinians, right? And they also have access to roads for Israeli persons only that Palestinians cannot drive on, so that they can be connected to one another and to Israel proper, where Palestinians are prohibited from traveling, right? And they're distinguished on those roads by different colored license plates, specifically yellow for Israelis and green for Palestinians, okay? These settlements in 1993, at the start of the peace process, there were approximately 200,000 settlers at the start of the peace process. Today, that number has tripled to 600,000, okay? So Israel has single-handedly increased this population and frankly destroyed the contiguity and any kind of resemblance of a two-state solution. Okay, I'm not even getting into Jerusalem. I'm not getting into these other topics. Let me tell you one more thing. Even if there weren't settlements, okay? Even if Israel were to remove all the settlements and reroute its wall to get to the green line, to get to its green line and get rid of its military outposts. Why does Israel have settlements? You'll see here. Israel has its settlements built across this line very carefully. That even if the reason that they did this is very strategic. This is where the Western Aquifer lays, which is one of the most significant sources of water for Israel. And water is actually as valuable as petrol. 60% of the Western Aquifer runs under the West Bank. Israel derives 80% of its yield from that water source. And in fact, former prime ministers Menachem Begin, Ariel Sharon, and Ehud Olmert have said that this is not for negotiation. That the maldistribution of this water is not for negotiation. And in fact, the Oslo Accords consecrated this in Article 40, where Israel still has control over how much water it gets. Now, the distribution of water is incredibly significant because not having water for example, the farmers that live in the Jordan Valley means that they have no water to feed their crops, which means that they have no livelihood, which means they are forcibly displaced. Okay? And if you how many of you have been to the region? Have visited the West Bank? Have you driven through the Jordan Valley? If you drive through the Jordan Valley, right, what you'll see is on one side of the road, plush palm trees as far as the eye can see, which constitutes approximately $1 billion palm industry, run by 9,000 Israeli settlers, okay? And on the other side of the road, absolute arid, it's tumbleweed, and this is the Palestinian land where Palestinian farmers used to be, who have been forcibly displaced as a result of this maldistribution of water, okay? So the control of water is critical because it also determines who lives where. So let's go back. So, is this where I go back? Nope. Yes. Okay. So that is the two-state solution. If you think, you know, I've been saying that it's been dead for years. Other Palestinians have been saying it's been dead for years. Even now, Secretary John Kerry finally said that it's dead. There's nothing to resurrect. And despite the fact that Israel is a primary benefactor of U.S. taxpayers, our tax dollars, right? Israel has defied U.S. requests for a moratorium on settlement expansions. And so that's why this settler population continues to grow at a rapid pace. Okay. What about, so that's the two-state solution. Now, in terms of how Israel facilitates the rest of its population control to maintain its demographic balance, this is the heart of it. It bifurcates nationality and citizenship, okay? There is no such thing as Israeli nationality. You cannot be an Israeli national like you can be a US national, okay? You can be a Jewish national and an Israeli citizen. And in fact, Israeli Jewish citizen nationals appeared before the Supreme Court to ask to be recognized as Israeli nationals last year, and the Supreme Court said that this wasn't a judicial matter, this was a political matter. So what does it do to bifurcate nationality and citizenship? It means that Jewish people are nationals and citizens, that Jewish persons without the state still have access to more rights than the citizens within the state, and they have the right to become citizens at any point. That Palestinian Arabs are never eligible for nationality, they remain citizens only. You create a two-tiered system of citizenship and nationality versus citizenship only. And Palestinians have no nationality at all because they were denationalized with the 1952 law. It denationalized them following the order of a 1925 British law which gave Palestinians nationality. So Palestinians, in addition to being occupied and refugees, are also stateless and without nationality, okay? What does that do? This. So I'm giving you guys an overview. Israel uses the law. It matters very much that Israel uses the law in order to facilitate its domination and its expansion, because if it were to just do it by outright brute force, it would have, you know, it would have a much harder time on the international scene than it does. But it regards itself as a state governed by the rule of law. And so that's why these laws matter significantly. And here you can see the privileges of nationality. How do you become a Jewish national? It's recognized, you have to be born of a Jewish mother or become converted to Judaism and not a member of any other religion. Palestinians are not eligible to become converts to Judaism. I think many Palestinians have thought of that way they can access the privileges of Jewish nationality. They're not eligible to become converts, and so the rights of nationality are vested in grandchildren, a grandchild of a Jewish person, the spouse of a Jewish person, the spouse of a child of a Jewish person, or the spouse of a grandchild of a Jewish person, unless they have been a Jewish person and voluntarily changed their religion, then they can't have access to this, okay? And it means that they can enter Israel at any time, obtain citizenship, live anywhere they want, including in Israel and in the settlements. Yes?
So if a Jewish woman marries a Palestinian man, and they have kids, does the kid have a right to go to Israel?
If that, but
It's the mother, right?
yes,
Yeah.
the mother. Now, hold on. It gets complicated because, and I'm gonna get to everything, obviously. If this Jewish Israeli woman marries a Palestinian man from the West Bank, they can't live in Israel at all. So no, they wouldn't have access because of a law that was passed in 2003, in which the Israeli Supreme Court upheld in January 2012, called the Ban on Family Reunification, which declares persons from enemy states ineligible for obtaining residency within Israel. Conveniently, what are those enemy states? The West Bank, the Gaza Strip, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. I think Iran was just thrown in there for the fun of it because there aren't many Palestinians there, but in the other countries named there are. But Iran was just like, hey, just throw that in enemy states. They're bad people, right? Anyway, they're not, but I'm just saying that. Okay, so they have full panoply of rights regardless if they're living abroad in the occupied territories or in Israel. In contrast, and here's where it's so, this is why, people always ask, why aren't Palestinians waging the third intifada and fighting for their rights and liberating themselves and putting up with this? Well, guess what? Their interests have been fragmented and refracted several times over because of the law and the ways that the law defines them and distinguishes their interests. So that there are Palestinians living in Jerusalem. Those who live in Jerusalem. So Jerusalem is part of the occupied, East Jerusalem is part of the occupied West Bank. Israel unilaterally annexed it in 1980. The world has rejected this annexation. Israel continues to establish a Jewish majority there. Okay? And it does so by removing the Palestinians who live there. Palestinians who live there did not become citizens of Israel. They were given ID cards, right? They were given tenuous ID cards that could be revoked at any time. And I think the number of revocations in 2008 alone was something like 5,000 revocations. Okay? So no rights, they're kind of in limbo in East Jerusalem waiting to be removed. They can be citizens in Israel. And this is kind of the best that it gets, right? They can vote, they can work, but they are forever a fifth column and the enemy within the state. And in fact, in a 2012 Haaretz poll, 75% of respondents suggested that if there were a two-state solution, the Palestinian citizens of Israel should be transferred to the new Palestinian state, so they haven't been integrated socially, politically, economically, and 28% suggested that they should be forcibly transferred. So there's an animosity towards them as well, and we can talk about that. Okay, then citizenship is never available to non-Jewish nationals. Palestinians can't apply for citizenship. They can't apply for return. They're precluded as a matter of law. So then we get to Palestinian Gaza Strip ID holders, persona non grata, live under siege, in hermeneutic, okay, let me say words I can pronounce, in sealed off conditions as a result of the siege, a naval blockade and a land siege. This is the Gaza Strip. Palestinian West Bank ID holders, a little better than the Gaza Strip, but also limited movement, subject to arbitrary ID revocation, displacement, and limitation on their movement. And then Palestinian refugees who are in exile, who have no right to return at all and have no claims upon the state. Yes?
Who has voting rights in this regime? Who has voting rights?
Voting rights belong to the Palestinian citizens of the state as well as the Israeli citizens.
So any Jewish person, like in New York, who becomes a citizen who's never been to Israel can vote?
Yeah, they're a citizen. If they've claimed citizenship, they can vote an absentee voter. But if you're Jewish and you haven't claimed that, you can't do absentee voting. Does that make sense? Yeah, so Palestinians can vote, but increasingly they have been moving towards boycotting of elections altogether because of the conditions under which they live. Okay? And that's another, we can talk about, like, that's another story of accusing Palestinian leaders of treason, like Azmi Bashara and other Palestinian citizens, but I don't want to get too deep in the weeds. Now, have I already gotten too deep in the weeds? Am I okay? Mm-hmm. Okay, great. So, now, this is to establish, based on this bifurcation of nationality and citizenship. So first, let's just establish where we've been, right, to see where we're going. Two-state solution, Israel doesn't want it. Has single-handedly killed it. Okay, that would have maintained its Jewish majority. The one-state solution, it doesn't want because that, it says, would destroy itself as a Jewish state, right? The solution of apartheid, to actually just say, increasingly Israel's right wing is accepting this and saying it's okay, we can just be an apartheid state. And for analysts, they already call it an apartheid state. And then the fourth, diminish the Palestinian population, concentrate them, and also undermine their metaphysical and physical presence. Okay? So I'm talking now how the law facilitates this number 4. Okay? And I've shown you how what the bifurcation does in terms of law. Now, how does Israel then limit the Palestinian population? One is by precluding the right of return for Palestinian refugees. Israel claims that the return of 6.6 million refugees to their homes would destroy the state. So if you've ever been in a space where you see someone screaming at a Palestinian solidarity activist and saying, you want to destroy Israel because they said we believe in the right of return for Palestinians, this is why. Because they are equating the return of Palestinian refugees as undermining the Jewish demographic majority and therefore destroying the state. Except all they're doing, right? They're challenging this demographic balance and frankly the morality of such a balance. Okay? And they've done this by law. The law of return, all Jews are entitled to it, while the Palestinian right of return is denied. Another way that it's done, and I mentioned this, so people say, look, there are others who will say, look, I agree with everything that you say, and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip should end, but don't talk about Israel, right? So this is the Peter Baynards of the world, right? Very liberal Zionists who are appealing. J Street, for example, although J Street also opposes BDS, and we'll talk about that, but this idea is that Israel isn't an apartheid state, but what it does in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip is awful, except within Israel itself, Israel is trying to diminish its non-Jewish population as well. I mentioned the ban on family reunification, so that it could reduce the number of, so if a Palestinian from Nazareth studies it at the Sorbonne and meets a Palestinian from Bethlehem, which is in the West Bank, they can't marry and move back to Nazareth because of the ban on family reunification. Because the Palestinian from Bethlehem is from an enemy state. And that's a way that in these cases they have to emigrate elsewhere, reducing that population. The Israeli High Court in January 2012 said that while we feel very bad about these tragic love stories, the truth is this is a matter of life and death. And so the court explicitly uses the language of the presence and number of Palestinians as being an existential threat. Okay? And then the prior plan. So let me go back to the map, because maps are great. This is the Negev, right? The Negev desert, also known as the Nakba. Here, about 11, this is home to approximately 150,000 Palestinians who are pastoral nomads, right? They are descendants of 19 tribes. I'm not even going to say what happened to them in 1948. Let me just say what's happening to them today. There is something called the Power Plan. Israel plans to remove 70,000 Palestinian Bedouins, to forcibly displace them into urban townships so that they can be civilized, okay? And in their place, to build 30 new Jewish settlements. So Israel's Jewish expansion is not just limited to the West Bank, it also exists within Israel itself, okay? And in addition to the 30 new Jewish settlements, the Jewish National Fund, how many of you see the cans to give money to the Jewish National Fund to build a tree, to plant a tree, right? The Jewish National Fund will build a forest to erase the presence of Palestinians who are there. All right? So this talk that Israel's egregion, right? That it's, I don't know, what's the word, that its transgressions only exist in the occupied territory either is disingenuous or ignorant of the fact that these policies exist within the state as well. Okay, so that's within Israel. Identity, if you have identity cards, if you're in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, or in East Jerusalem, your identity card can be revoked at almost any time. So in full transparency, my father's identity card was revoked years ago, so I have to travel as an American tourist to visit family and home, and when I travel, I'm always subject to an arbitrary denial of entry at the border by Israeli soldiers who control that border. Between 1967 and 2010, Israel revoked 13,115 residency orders and residency cards and silent deportation. I think that was in Jerusalem alone, and in the West Bank the number is 140,000 residency revocations. And but for those residency revocations, the Palestinian population in the occupied territory would be greater by 14%. So it's not just that Israel is okay with as many Palestinians as possible in the occupied territories. Even there, it is working to socially engineer the number of Palestinians who are there.
So just a quick question. When you say that the card is revoked, what is the immediate practical effect of that? Do you have to leave the West Bank if you no longer have your
They
ID
revoke
card?
it when they're not there.
So you can't return to the
You
West
cannot
Bank?
return.
Okay.
You're denied entry. You're rarely deported.
Okay.
Yeah, you're denied entry. Although deportation and the revocation of citizenship is not, rare either. It happens. So okay. So Military Order 1650, which prohibits infiltration, basically says that Palestinians who are from the Gaza Strip studying in a West Bank university in their 4th year of studies, right before their finals in their senior year, for example, can have their residence, can be considered infiltrators and deported and denied that, for example, bachelor's degree and returned to the Gaza Strip. So this idea that Israel also wants to encourage a Palestinian national identity between the West Bank and Gaza is not true. They are trying to increasingly divide the population, right? The wall that was built, I showed you how 85% of it meanders in the West Bank. Well, what it does is it also captures 55,000 Palestinians between the Green Line and the wall, who are basically now stuck. And you guys, who of you study refugee law at all? There's refugees, there's internally displaced persons. Well, there's been a new moniker given to this 55,000 person population of internally stuck persons. They're just stuck. They have nowhere to go. Although the mayor of Jerusalem has suggested that they have their Jerusalemite residency revoked. Right? So again, this will be part of this deportation. In the Jordan Valley, I showed you the Jordan Valley. That's the site of $1 billion palm date industry that benefits settlers. And it's actually a target for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Radhika might talk about that a little bit more. It's 30% of the West Bank. Israel insists that it has to have a military presence in the Jordan Valley because it needs to protect its eastern border from infiltration. And the population in the Jordan Valley has been reduced from 400,000 Palestinians in 1967 to 56,000 Palestinians today, and steadily declining. Okay? As a result of basic things like the maldistribution of water. Okay? And then the barrier, I've shown you that. So this is kind of what we're working with today. Okay? So you have, this is the Jordan Valley. This is Jericho, which is Palestinian controlled as part of Area C, and I didn't get into that. I don't think it's relevant right now. But this Jordan Valley is 30%, and this is where the Palestinian population has been steadily and systematically diminished. These are the areas where the wall meanders. The blue dots are settlements. And let me show you, if you effectively cut it up, so look at it, this is the wall, by the way. So the wall, Palestinians have suggested, have shown that it doesn't separate Israel from Palestinians, it separates Palestinians from Palestinians. It separates Palestinians' families from other families, it separates them from their agricultural lands and livelihoods, it separates their children from their schools. And this is what Palestine looks like today. These non-contiguous islands, which Palestinians refer to as cantons or bantustans. The reason that they're not separate, that they're not contiguous, is because around them is some sort of settlement infrastructure. From roads to military outposts to settlements themselves, or military declared lands, like in the Jordan Valley. This is what the Palestinian state looks like. Okay? But again, I'm showing you what the occupied territory looks like. I haven't even talked about the Gaza Strip, but I'm emphasizing that Israel's approach to Palestinians doesn't discriminate on where they live, whether they be refugees exiled, whether they be citizens of the state, or whether they be civilians under the occupation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. But this is just to show you what exactly it looks like in the West Bank. And that's what it would look like. So in a two-state solution, these would be Bantustans. And even if it was a one-state solution, these would look like reservations, right? Like Native American reservations, completely undermining social, political, economic self-determination, any kind of national cohesion, even any kind of new cultural production is undermined as a result of this separation. Israel has exacerbated the separation now in its law. It's proposing new legislation that would distinguish between Christian and Muslim Palestinian citizens of Israel, and actually conscript Christians into the Israeli army to say that you're different from the Muslims and you're part of a Judeo-Christian civilization. But the trend that we're seeing is this increasing fragmentation, division, at the expense of Palestinian national identity and unity. In response to this, in 2005, on the one-year anniversary of the International Court of Justice 2004 advisory opinion, the Boycott National Committee launched something called Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and it demanded that international solidarity, in the words of Philip Agnew, right, that we bear this burden, proposed that international solidarity boycott Israeli goods, divest from Israeli holdings, and sanction Israel as a state until it abides by three demands: the return of Palestinian refugees, the end of colonization of all Arab lands, and the equality of its Palestinian citizens within Israel. And now, as Radhika will discuss, I think, again, that campaign has been, began in 2005. We're nearly at a 10-year mark, even though it slightly began earlier. UC Berkeley students in 2001 kind of did their own anarchist thing as well. Anyway, I'm one of those students, so I admit. But at that 10-year mark, it's gaining a lot of traction, right? Alice Walker joined the cultural boycott, refused to translate Her Color Purple into Hebrew. Naomi Klein refused to translate her book, The Shock Doctrine, by a particular press within Israel. Angela Davis has joined this boycott. Roger Waters of Pink Floyd refused to perform in Israel. The American Studies Association passed an academic boycott. The Native American and Indigenous Studies Association passed a boycott. The Association of Asian American Studies passed a boycott, right? And recently, the Modern Language Association is passing an academic boycott, or at least, saying what's wrong with Israel. And that's to say nothing of, in the past 2 years, 5 out of the 10 UC, University of California systems passed academic resolutions to divest from Israel. I mean, this and 22 campuses across the US have also done that. And of all this success that I tell you about in the United States, it diminishes and is paled by the movement's success in Europe. Okay? So it's actually, whereas this movement was once ridiculed for being left marginal fringe, now I think Harold Corr in 2010 referred to BDS as the second most significant threat to Israel, just after Iran's nuclear capability, or nuclear capable Iran, I should say. So this is why this is so risky, and it's been, they've tried, and Maria, of course, can talk about this, and Radhika will. There's a movement to try to prosecute those who pursue BDS as participating in hate crimes and in perpetuating anti-Semitism. And so with that,
So I'm Radhika Steinoth. I'm a staff attorney at Palestine Solidarity Legal Support. We're pretty new. We started about a year ago, or a year and a half ago. And just to give you a little bit of background before I get into the work that we're doing. So as Nora mentioned, there is this rise in activism in the United States and around the world in support of Palestinian rights. It's really, really exciting. She mentioned that there's been all these victories on the boycott, divestment, sanctions front. The student movement is growing. It's really exciting, and it's pretty amazing seeing how far the movement has come so quickly. The BDS movement was styled after the South African anti-apartheid movement, and it's picking up speed, and this is a really exciting thing. But in response to the rise in activism in the United States, we're also seeing this rise in repression. And it's a coordinated attack by off-campus, well-funded pro-Israeli groups. A few years ago, something called the Roy Institute, which is located in Israel, funded by various ministries in Israel, said that they've got to respond to this delegitimization campaign of Israel by countering BDS and by attacking. And so, unfortunately, we've been seeing a lot of this in the United States, and our organization came out of these attacks that we've been seeing in college campuses and activist groups and professors. Here are just a few pictures. Before I get started though, how many of you guys are students? Okay, mostly students. How many of you are in a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter or some other kind of Palestine-related activism? Happens to be our intern. Anyways, that's what I figured. It is a Palestine 101, a talk, so that makes sense. So I just thought I'd show you, since most of you are students, I'm going to focus this talk mostly on student activism, but I thought I'd show you just a few quick pictures of what college students are doing, because it's really exciting stuff, and it's to educate other students and to highlight what's happening with the occupation, Israeli apartheid. So this is Columbia University campus. One popular type of action is a mock checkpoint action. So Noura mentioned this apartheid system set up in the West Bank. When I was there was during the Second Intifada, there was over 400 checkpoints, and the map that Noura put up of Israel and the West Bank and Gaza, that's about as big as the state of New Jersey. So you could imagine over 400 checkpoints in the state of New Jersey. It gets really hard to move. So one of the things students do is do this mock checkpoints actions on campus so they can show people, show other students what it's like a little bit. They'll do mock walls to highlight the apartheid wall that's in the West Bank, Israeli apartheid weeks as well. So that's a mock wall. How many of you guys have heard of Israeli Apartheid Week or seen that on your campus? Okay. So this is another action by Tufts Students for Justice in Palestine, highlighting checkpoints. Another popular type of action that students do are mock eviction notices. So Nora was talking about the power plan and Bedouins in the Nakba getting evicted, and so students are doing this creative type of action where they'll flyer with these eviction notices and put them under dorm rooms. And so students will look at it and they'll say eviction notice, and it'll have some information about what's happening in Palestine, and then it'll say at the bottom, this is not a real eviction notice. So it's a good way to educate. And so so those are just a few types of things that we've seen. Yeah.
Just a note, I don't know if you saw this, but the eviction notices, those have been cracked down on actually in a couple places.
Yes, definitely, and I'm going to get into that. Yeah, so So basically, our organization, Palestine Solidarity Legal Support, started about 1.5 years ago because of this growth in activism and because students have been having their free speech rights clamped down upon, right? So getting in trouble for doing mock eviction action notices, or even things like trying to start a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter and being told you can't use the word Palestine, or you can't use the word Students for Justice in Palestine, it's problematic. And because of these kinds of things, and I'll get into that a little bit through the presentation. This is actually a picture of a student from CUNY Staten Island. It's a very active SJP chapter there. And myself, I'm a longtime Palestine activist as well. I know Nora from law school, even though she graduated before I started. I was an SJP activist, solidarity activist. I lived in the occupied territories during the Second Intifada from 2002 to 2003, and in Gaza for several months later on. So I came from this, as an activist, and particularly I became an attorney because when I was in Palestine in 2002, protesting the wall and sitting in front of bulldozers, I got arrested, and I realized I didn't know what my rights were when I was being taken in by Israeli soldiers. It's like, do I have the right to remain silent? I don't know. What are my rights here? And so we started working really closely with progressive and left Israeli attorneys, some who were good movement lawyers and some who were less good movement lawyers, and seeing, from the activist perspective, what works in legal representation and what doesn't work, inspired me to go to law school. And so I ended up going to law school at Berkeley, and when I was a student at, an SJP student, even as a law student, at a very progressive school, because of complaints from pro-Israeli groups, the administration tried to clamp down on what we were doing, and we didn't know what to do, even as law students. We kind of put up with some stuff that we probably shouldn't have. And so I think that's why our organization started, just to respond to students when they have questions, because they don't necessarily know what their rights are. Even law students don't, and certainly undergrads don't. So, let's see. So here are some of the trends in repression that we've seen in our short time in existence as an organization. So we're seeing administrative harassment, disparate treatment for SJP chapters, schools changing the rules in response to student activism, criminal prosecutions, Title VI and lawfare. I probably won't go too much into that, the time constraints, and then even legislative pressure. So administrative harassment. Now that sounds like the most, I'm starting with kind of the most boring thing, right? But it actually ends up really chilling speech. So what we're seeing on a lot of campuses is actually SJP chapters that are really active and are trying to hold lots of educational events, invite speakers, have talks. They can't reserve rooms, so they put in a room request, and then they don't get the room approved until 5 minutes before the event's supposed to be scheduled. So they can't advertise it, right? Or on other campuses, the room request is lost, or they give them a different room. And this is, every event, like 10 events throughout a whole academic year, right? And students aren't stupid. They're part of other activist groups as well, right? And they're like, wait, when I try to do the exact same thing in the 3 other activist groups I'm in, I don't get into these problems. And some students just get tired and they just stop reserving rooms. They just try to find an empty one and hold it there. It's really stressful. We also see SJP presidents repeatedly being called in. I mean, this is several different schools. Every time they want an event, they have to have a conversation with security. And it just takes a lot of time. I mean, a lot of students are working class. Like, they have jobs, they have lives, and on top of education and trying to be activists. So it's really challenging. So we talk to them when they have questions about that. I'm not going to give you too many examples of everything. Disparate treatment. So with regards to the mock eviction action that you had. So what we're also seeing is that sometimes there are rules, but everyone breaks them, right? Sometimes schools have rules on flyering in dorms, but frat boys and have parties, and they put like their flyers under the doors. There's Chinese food menus. Everyone's flying all over the place, right? But when SJP students do it, they get called in. They get campus police knocking on their doors, or chapters getting suspended. That's what happened with Northeastern. We worked with those students. This is a Northeastern protest. Same thing goes with flyering. You guys are in school. You're not supposed to put. Most schools have rules on where you put flyers. Let's say not in the bathroom, but hey, there are flyers all over the bathroom, right? But wait, if one of those flyers is supporting Palestinian rights or is about a Palestinian event, they get in trouble. So that's a really big problem that we're seeing. Just a couple examples. Another thing that we're seeing is actually just changing the rules. So I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with what happened at Columbia University or Barnard College. Okay, a couple people in here. So basically, this is Barnard College, uptown by Columbia, historic women's college. And the Students for Justice for Palestine chapter applied to get their banner hung. You can see it's like professionally done. They actually like hang it high above, and there's these metal wires and things like that. And this has been going on for decades. Whenever a club has an event they'd like to advertise for, they can just fill out the papers, the school hangs them. So the SJP chapter was advertising for an Israeli Apartheid Week event. They applied, the school gave them this banner material, they painted it themselves, they hung it, gave it back to the school put it up around 5 in the evening, and then a few hours later, pro-Israeli groups, the campus Hillel, which has, I think, either 22 or 24 paid employees, it's kind of crazy, right? Basically said, oh, this is, complained about this, said it was threatening to Jewish students. It says Stand for Justice, Stand for Palestine, has the map of historic Palestine that Nora had put up earlier, but it's all hand painted. And immediately, overnight, the school took it down. When the students walked by 7 in the morning the next day, it was gone. So they basically called in maintenance because it's really high up. Overnight, took it down. And said, oh, we got a lot of complaints from alumni donors, things like that. And they're changing the policy. So they're reconsidering this policy now. I mean, this free speech policy, banners hanging on Barnard, which has been for decades. And so we're seeing this in a lot of schools where they're saying, oh wait, they're basically suppressing student speech in support of Palestine, but then they're like, well, no, it's really not that. So we're gonna just not allow any student speech. And we're seeing this in a few different schools, not just Barnard. It's really problematic as well. Criminal charges and police visits. How many of you guys heard of the UCI 11 case? A few handful. So this was actually a Muslim Students Union group at the University of California, Irvine. And they were protesting an event by the Israeli ambassador. And they decided to do a silent, not like a walkout, where when the speaker started talking, people got up, said something for a minute, and walked out. And a few students did this. And this was in 2010. And they were criminally charged about a year later under an obscure California statute on disrupting a public meeting. Again, this was totally crazy, and we lost and we appealed, and we lost the appeal, unfortunately. So that goes into a little bit of the disparate treatment, but also the fact that student speech in support of Palestinian rights is being prosecuted and charged, and with Northeastern, campus police knocked on 3 students' doors over a flyering incident. And the president of that SJP is actually a white student. There's a mix of white and Arab and Muslim students in that group. The only students that got visited were Arab or Muslim students. And so that's really, we're seeing that more as well, where students are, where police are getting involved in basically routine student affairs, or what at most should be misconduct, which is really problematic. We're also seeing this rise in anti-boycott legislation. have any of you guys heard about what's been going on in the country with that? No? Okay, so Nura had mentioned about these divestment, or these boycott resolutions that have been passed recently. One of which was the American Studies Association, which is basically this association of professors for an American Studies departments in the United States. They passed it in December. It was really exciting. And what we saw immediately was states, including the state of New York, but also Maryland and Illinois, even Kansas and North Carolina, kind of random, passing bills to, that said that if any university paid fees to an organization like the ASA, who had passed a boycott resolution, all state funding to those universities would be pulled for the following year. In New York, it was for the following year. In different states, it was different, and they amended it. But basically, punishing schools who, paid membership fees, or reimburse professors for membership fees, who were part of an organization that have boycotted Israel. And this is really problematic on many different levels, right? Because boycott is protected First Amendment activity. This country has a time-honored tradition of boycotts. You can imagine that if these kinds of things were introduced or passed during the anti-apartheid struggle, what that would have looked like. So one of the things that we've been doing is, along with we're cooperating counsel with the Center for Constitutional Rights, is writing legislators saying, advising them on law, telling them why this is so problematic. And luckily, none of these bills with teeth that actually have punishments have passed. In some states, there's been sort of a watered down version where it's just a resolution condemning them and saying that these kinds of bills are anti-Semitic, which of course they're not. This is one trend that we're seeing a lot of. And on the legislative front also, we're seeing a lot of state legislators or local politicians trying to suppress student speech by getting events canceled. We saw this with Brooklyn College, where they had this event on boycott, divestment, sanctions, and local politicians, tried to pressure the administration to cancel events. Same thing happened at UC Hastings. There was a conference on very legal, on lawfare and litigation in Palestine, international law, and things like that, and was going to be held at UC Hastings, and politicians put a lot of pressure on the board to cancel it. They didn't actually cancel it, but they had to take the name UC Hastings off of it. So that was kind of ridiculous. We're seeing a lot of that as well. Lawsuits and cyberbullying, we advise them when they're dealing with the administration. What we're really seeing is because of a lot of buildings and big donors actually are very pro-Israeli in this country. A lot of buildings, one of the I think it's Shulman Hall or something, Northeastern, is named after the former president of the Zionist, or the board member of the Zionist Organization of America. So schools are coming under a lot of pressure, especially when they're looking at their budgets from pro-Israeli groups that have a lot of money, that are really well organized, and when SJPs are holding an event or doing some kind of action, they're being told to suspend those students or to punish those students or to not allow those kinds of actions. And schools are responding. That said, we are also responding, and even if as activists we don't have as much money, we do have petitions and protests, and that was really exciting to see that happen in Northeastern. And in the end, those students that were the SJP chapter that was suspended last semester is back on with full rights in the spring or in the fall. And when NYU students did a very similar action last month and got a similar response from pro-Israeli groups, the administration didn't suspend them. They talked to them. They didn't, they did things that were a little bit problematic, but at the end of the day, there wasn't any punishment meted out, nor should there have been, because we didn't think that the NYU students actually broke the rules. So other things that we help with is students who've been falsely accused of things, bullying, police knocking on the door. A lot of students actually invite the cops in when they knock on their door because they're like, oh, I haven't done anything wrong. That's really problematic, right? And because, you know, well, I won't go into that, history and stuff, but yeah, so we talked to them about that. We give a lot of Know Your Rights workshops, which are really great. So I've been doing a lot of that, going around the country at like SGB conventions and stuff. And the students are, you know, I often think, sometimes I'm on panels with, to me, seem like more exciting panels. I'm like, really, you guys want to like hear about the law for a couple hours? But the students really want to hear about the law for a couple hours. These are not law students. So they're like sponges, like they just want to know what their rights are and what to do in a million different circumstances. So that's really great. And then we also do a lot of advocacy, like I mentioned, like with this legislative stuff, you know, writing letters and things like that to both administrations and to politicians when they're either doing something problematic or it looks like they're going to do something problematic, just to say, hey, you know, this looks like it could be, you know, raise some constitutional red flags. You should think about doing this, and you may face a lawsuit. So I think that's about it. I want to leave a little bit. I guess we have 5 minutes for Q&A, but I'll be around later. But this is our. That's my contact info at the top. But follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, look at our website.
Sorry, that was my bad for talking for too long. Took up that time. I apologize.
You had to go over like, you know,
yes,
a couple hundred years of history, and I was just talking about the possible years. So, oh, and I forgot to mention when I say we have actually documented. One of the things that we do is track incidents of repression, and in 2013 alone, we tracked 115 cases, and 80 of those on college campuses, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. We haven't been around that long, so it's not like everyone who has an incident is calling us. You know, a lot of schools still don't know about us or don't bother calling us because they don't think that, right? So it's kind of crazy, and this is just, I mean, we only deal with Palestine activism, right? So.
And I basically got to law school and made friends with the Palestinian immediately. And so I've been like looking at some books, and I like found one, I can't remember what it's called, but it's like basically a historical primer. I got to like 1930 and my eyes glazed over. Do you have any recommendations for like 101 books that are for like people with ADHD?
Phyllis Bennis has a primer on Palestine and Israel, so it reads like a manual. Really, really short from the Institute for Policy Studies. It's not a manuscript as much as it's like a booklet, but it's great. It'll give you a version. In terms of historian, there's a lot of Palestinian historians you can read, like Ibn Masalha and Shirin Sayali and others. I would recommend Ilan Pape, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Yeah, and so then there's, in terms of an activist book would be the Omar Barghouti's Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, or just BDS. And in terms of kind of, you know, this idea that I presented here about the solution, one state, two state, what's going on in history, Ali Abu Ni'ma's A Bold Solution.
Okay, thank you.
Anarchists Against the Wall. Israeli Anarchists Against the Wall. There's the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions. There's a lot. But I would say that's a really common accusation. And it's also really problematic, right? Because, you know, you're criticizing a state, right? It's like, you know, if you criticize Saudi Arabia's human rights policies, that wouldn't make you, you know, Islamophobic, right? Even though Saudi is a Muslim state. So that's a criticism that a lot of students are getting, and it's inaccurate and it's unfair. If you have any other.
Well, the only thing that I would add is that even the Jewish organizations then are also deemed anti-Semitic, even if they're Jewish and claim to be self-hating Jews. And so what it is a resistance, what Radhika is describing is a resistance to any criticism at all, and you create it almost becomes sacrilegious to have or heretic even, to have these conversations, when in fact the project of collapsing a religion, Judaism, with a political project is the work of Israel itself and pro-Israelis, and not the work of those who want to criticize Israel and spare, right, ethnic bigotry, which everyone opposes. And so, it's, you know, I think it's one of those things to then challenge the accuser to be able to unpack that accusation.
I work for an organization that works on corporate accountability, so I certainly understand the power of boycotts, divestment, and appealing to consumers. But I'm just wondering, have you seen evidence, or do you have examples of the impact that this is having in Israel?
It's having a big impact. I mean, well, so I guess there's two. When BDS was first announced in 2005, you know, Israel sort of laughed at it, was like, who are these people, right? And then now they're really fighting it. And I can't remember the number, but I think like Netanyahu mentioned BDS like 18 times or 20 times, whatever it was, like in one speech. Like there's, you know, there's been meetings and ministries of how to counter, you know, the BDS threat, the delegitimization threat. So I'd say yeah, and like, I mean, you could see this, I don't know if you guys, how many of you guys have seen the Scarlett Johansson SodaStream campaign? Yeah, so everyone here, you know, and that was like an amazing campaign, partially because, you know, Scarlett Johansson's gorgeous, so like Money Magazine, CNN, like Us Magazine, pardon?
Can you tell me what it is?
Yeah, so basically SodaStream, how many of you guys know what a SodaStream machine is? It's basically like a home carbonation device, so you can not buy like Perrier, you can just make it in your house. And it's an Israeli company, and its factories in the occupied Palestinian territories, violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, problematic on many different levels. The BDS call, you know, is to boycott Israeli goods, right? And so so Scarlett Johansson became the spokesperson, or a spokesperson for SodaStream machines, was going to be on the Super Bowl commercial, and she was also the Oxfam, I forget what her title was, like ambassador for Oxfam or something. And so, so there was this really great activist campaign to basically to get Scarlett Johansson to quit being you know, the spokesperson for SodaStream, or for Oxfam to drop her, because you can't be a human rights person and support the occupation at the same time, right? And unfortunately, she made the wrong decision, but it was a really great educational opportunity, you know, in this country for people, you know, because of the amazing amount of press it got. And there was Twitter campaigns, and the graphics were really great, and like a lot of people heard about it, and it still comes up.
Yeah.
So, so I would say like, yeah, I mean, BDS is on a roll. It's had a lot of victories. I mean, you have to keep in mind it's only like a 9-year-old campaign. Like in South Africa, it took decades. You know, so.
I just want to add two things to this. One is, and this is from, you know, from the naysayers still, who are like, yeah, show us how BDS is going to fix anything. Show us the numbers. Like, how is this affecting Israel at all, or its policies? And so the you know, the I guess, specific answer to that, if one does answer the question, right, we learn not to answer people's questions. Answer the bigger question that they're asking. But if you answer that specific question, it isn't affecting Israel. They aren't rerouting the wall. They aren't changing their policies. They aren't letting refugees into the country. They aren't releasing political prisoners. They're doing nothing in response to BDS that would demonstrate any kind of efficacy on the part of the campaign. So that's one. But Radhika is right that what Israel is not fearing the economic impact of BDS as much as it's fearing the political relations impact. For it, this is a battle over moral legitimacy, right? It has branded itself as a David, you know, against an Arab Goliath. And so what BDS has done is undermined that image. So in fact, Israel is the aggressor and not the victim, right? So that's what's at most stake. Now the second point that I'd like to add is that BDS is not a panacea for the liberation of Palestine. It's simply a tactic, and it's a tactic for solidarity, right? But it's not a liberation movement. And so for Palestinians, it's a tactic, one of many, and there are other things that Palestinians are leading themselves for their own liberation, including hunger strikes within the prisons, including mass demonstrations in Bil'ain and Nil'ain and other places against the wall, including mass demonstrations and student boycotts and the rest of it. And boycott is a tactic for solidarity in response. So, and for me, that's the answer to the bigger question, that it's not supposed to free Palestine, right? So yeah.
I'm curious your comments on one specific campaign. I was involved in the campaign to try to get the Presbyterian Church to divest, and there were two resolutions. One was boycott all goods produced in the occupied territories, and the other one was to divest from Caterpillar and a couple of other companies. And the Jewish community went all out, 110%, to defeat the divestment campaign, and they said nothing on the boycott campaign. They said the divestment resolution was anti-Semitic, and they didn't do. And the boycott one passed, and the divestment one failed by one vote, which was a victory in itself. And the question I had for you is, what does this suggest that they're much more worried about divestment than boycott?
So I guess what I'm hearing you say is that you're challenging with the economic, right? My statement that this isn't about how this can economically hurt Israel, because obviously the Presbyterian Church divesting would mean that it actually has holdings in Israeli corporations that benefit from the occupation, and that would actually tangibly divest, whereas boycott just means that everybody within the Presbyterian congregation, exercises their own free will.
And it's hard to figure out what
Right.
products are actually being produced, etc.
It's much more ambiguous, right?
It's much more ambiguous, and the divestment, it wasn't so much that this will affect Israel per se right away, but this will affect what other companies decide, where other companies decide to invest.
That, or I was going to say boom, and then I remembered where I was, but okay, boom, that, and plus what other churches will do. So a watershed moment for the anti-apartheid movement was the endorsement of churches and their participation in divestment. So if the Presbyterian Church, green light, that's just the domino effect. And in fact, next would be the Methodist Church, which does have its own campaign, the Unitarian Universalists, and so on and so forth.
And then would be pension funds.
And pension funds, I mean, it just, so it's a gatekeeper, right? Their divestment, blocking the divestment. Boycott is amorphous. You're not sure, everybody's on their own, figure it out. It's just, saying it. But divestment would have that tangible effect of having a domino effect. And in fact, that is actually very true. It's also inevitable. And that's what, the opponents to divestment, this is a moving train. This movement doesn't, despite all of this vitriolic attack, this movement is only moving in one direction, despite the setbacks. And the Presbyterians are coming up on their next General Assembly next month. And I'm sure they're going to pass it next month. And we're going to see a new wave of that kind of thing. So I think we have time for one more question, and then we should wrap up because we've already kept people late, but I think we started late too.
Yeah.
Oh.
I have a friend who's Israeli, and I don't really like to get into it with her because it's less personal to me than it is to her, but she always brings up the David and Goliath thing. Even if we are mistreating Palestinians, you don't understand how afraid I feel for my family about being in the middle of the Middle East. So how do you respond to questions like that, and how real do you feel like that threat really is, if at all?
Why didn't you ask that question first? That's its own lecture. So we can definitely continue. I don't want to keep people over. Do you mind?
I mean, you can answer it, yeah.
Well,
No, go.
so here's my thing. One is, to question the premise of that is Israel is in the middle of the Middle East and seeks to be Jewish only at the exclusion. It's not a neighbor, right? It's an aggressor in a neighborhood, right? And so part of that is, I can get that theoretically. But the other thing that to take into consideration, into real consideration, is that Israel has normalized its relationships with most Arab states. In fact, Saudi Arabia, on behalf of the 22 members of the Arab League, offered in 2002, the Peace Initiative, offered complete normalized relationships with all of the Arab states if Israel ends its occupation only, right? And Israel refused. So, but notwithstanding that, it's not as if there was no Israel that there's going to suddenly be an attack on the people of Israel. There's a major difference. Jewish persons are an indigenous population to the Middle East, as I mentioned earlier in their talk. They're Yemeni and Iraqi and Syrian and Iranian and Algerian and Tunisian and Moroccan and so on and so forth, that there has been, what the creation of Israel has done is created the largest sectarian divide within the Middle East between Jews and non-Jews, where none necessarily existed. And so to think that if there was no Israel, suddenly there would be this onslaught against Israelis is ridiculous, because there are relationships that have been built. There's been this fear-mongering that if Iran had a nuclear weapon, it would attack it would attack Israel. No, it wouldn't. It wouldn't, because if it attacked Israel, it's not attacking just Israelis, it's also attacking, right, 20% of the population, which is non-Israeli, right? And it's not, this is a racist discourse, because in response, Iran would also be attacked, right? So it's not, this idea that Israel is therefore a buffer is something that we need to challenge. This is a very crude response, and I'm happy to talk about it a lot further, but it's just not true.
And I'll just keep this real short, but on an individual level, I think even if irrational, I do think the fear, I mean, it's probably genuine and it's there. And I would just say that, a lot of white South African Afrikaners had a real fear that when apartheid ended, that, they'd be in the sea of, 90% black, right? They were really scared, and hey, that fear was genuine. But does that mean that apartheid shouldn't have ended? Same with whites in the South, right? There's a real fear of black people. It's irrational, it's racist, it's wrong, but we can acknowledge it, but we're not going to say hey, let's bring back segregation, or
we just create laws
or these laws, or defend these laws, right? That have been discussed about today. So.